40 drones, launched in complete silence, skimming the surface of the Persian Gulf at 150 feet, low enough to hide, fast enough to kill. Each one packed with enough explosive force to punch through reinforced naval steel. And every single one of them was gone before most people in that region had even finished their morning tea. 114 seconds. That is all it took. But before we get to how this ended, we need to talk about why it began. Because the how is impressive. The why is terrifying. Let me paint you a picture of what the world looked like in the hours before those drones ever left the ground. It is just after 3 in the morning local time. The Persian Gulf is dark and still. Somewhere along the Iranian coastline, hidden beneath camouflage netting and layers of diplomatic denial, a launch crew receives a final confirmation signal. They have been preparing for this moment for weeks. The equipment they are working with is not the kind of hardware Iran has typically relied on. These are not the crude, slow, easily detectable drones that regional forces have fielded before. These are something different, something newer, something that carries the fingerprints of a country that officially has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. And out in the water, aboard a United States Navy destroyer operating within the carrier strike group of the USS Gerald R. Ford, a radar operator watches a screen. And then, in the space of a single breath, the screen changes. Not one contact, not 5, not 10. 40 individual signals blooming almost simultaneously across the display, all of them moving fast, all of them moving low, and all of them pointed directly at American ships. What happened next is one of the most remarkable demonstrations of military technology in the modern era. But this video is not just about what happened next. It is about everything that came before it, everything that made it possible, and everything that is now quietly, methodically unfolding in its aftermath. Because when you pull back the lens far enough, you realize that those 114 seconds were not the story. They were the moment the story finally broke the surface. To understand why Russia did what intelligence agencies now confirm it did, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the world. Not in a vague, geopolitical textbook kind of way, in a real, tangible, it affects the price of everything you buy kind of way. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is not a large margin when you consider that somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of crude oil pass through it every single day. Every single day. That is roughly 1/5 of the entire planet's daily petroleum consumption, moving through a corridor so narrow that the ships navigating it can practically see the Iranian coastline from their decks. If that waterway is closed, threatened, or even just perceived as unstable, the consequences radiate outward within hours. Oil prices climb, shipping insurance rates spike. Supply chains that most people never think about begin to buckle under the pressure. And within days, ordinary families, people who have never once thought about a naval radar screen or a rolling airframe missile, start feeling it every time they fill up their car or pay a heating bill. This is not abstract. This is the mechanism. And Russia, make no mistake, understood exactly what it was touching when it chose to insert itself into this equation. For months before the morning of the attack, Western intelligence agencies had been tracking something that, on the surface, looked almost mundane: aircraft movements, cargo flights crossing the Caspian Sea. Russian Ilyushin IL-76 heavy transport planes, the kind of aircraft that can carry enormous payloads across vast distances, had been observed entering Iranian airspace in a pattern that analysts found deeply interesting. The direction of travel had reversed. For the preceding period, the flow of military hardware between Russia and Iran had run primarily from Iran toward Russia, Iranian-designed Shahed drones being shipped west to support Moscow's grinding war in Ukraine. But somewhere along the way, that equation flipped. Russia was now sending equipment back. And what it was sending was not a diplomatic gift, it was an upgrade. The weapon in question was a Russian-developed variant of the Shahed 136 drone, designated the Giron 2, and what made this particular system alarming to Western analysts was not simply its existence, it was what had been done to it. These were not stock Iranian drones with a fresh coat of paint. Russian engineers had taken the original design and rebuilt it with lessons learned from 2 years of active combat operations in Ukraine, hardened anti-jamming satellite receivers, upgraded guidance packages, flight profiles refined through actual battlefield data that no amount of laboratory testing can replicate. Iran had given Russia a design. Russia had given Iran back something considerably more dangerous. The Kremlin denied everything, as it always does. Official spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called the reports fabrications, disinformation designed to isolate Russia diplomatically. But the satellite imagery did not lie. The flight logs did not lie. And the technical signature of the weapons that ultimately flew toward American ships in the early morning darkness would not lie either. So why did Russia do it? Why would Moscow risk this level of exposure, this level of direct implication in an armed attack on United States naval forces, at a moment when international scrutiny of Russian military behavior was already at historic highs? The answer requires you to think the way a strategist in the Kremlin thinks. Russia's core objective in the Middle East is not to destroy American ships. It is to stretch American attention, to force Washington to divide its focus, its resources, its political capital across multiple simultaneous theaters. Every hour that a U.S. carrier strike group spends managing a drone threat in the Persian Gulf is an hour not spent focused on Ukraine. Every political conversation about Iranian aggression is a conversation not being held about Russian aggression. The calculation was that by quietly arming Iran with upgraded drone technology, Moscow could achieve meaningful strategic disruption at a relatively low cost, while maintaining the plausible deniability that the official denials were designed to provide. It was, in the pure cold logic of great power competition, not an irrational move. The problem was that it ran directly into a defense system that had been built specifically to defeat exactly this kind of thinking. When those 40 drones lifted off the Iranian coastline and began their low-altitude run toward the carrier strike group, they were entering the operational envelope of what defense analysts call the kill web, an integrated, layered, networked architecture of sensors, radars, electronic warfare systems, missiles, guns, and aircraft that does not function like a single weapon but like a single organism. Every component feeds information to every other component. Every decision is made at machine speed, faster than any human operator could consciously direct. The engagement sequence that unfolded over the next 114 seconds was methodical in a way that almost defies intuition. Before a single missile was fired, electronic jamming systems reached out and knocked 12 drones out of the sky. They simply lost coherence. Their guidance systems, hardened as they were, encountered interference they could not overcome, and they fell. The remaining drones were handed off through the network. Medium-range interceptor missiles handled the next layer. The ship's 5-inch naval gun took more, and at the terminal end of the engagement, as the final drones closed to point-blank range, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-guided Gatling cannon capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, destroyed what was left. 0 American casualties, 0 U.S. ships damaged. And the entire Russian-supplied logistics chain that had supported the launch, the trucks, the launch rails, the crates of spare components staged on the coastal positions, was erased within minutes by precision counterstrike operations. From a purely military standpoint, it was a statement, not a boast, a statement, a factual demonstration of where the ceiling sits for this kind of proxy drone warfare when it encounters a fully integrated network defense architecture. Russia bet on quantity overwhelming quality. The kill web demonstrated that when quality is sufficiently advanced, quantity becomes irrelevant. But here's where most coverage of this event stops, and here's where we need to keep going. Because the consequences of what happened in that 114-second window are not contained within the military domain. They are spreading outward right now, and they are going to continue spreading in ways that touch far more people than the sailors on those ships. Economically, the impact was immediate and measurable. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to be physically blocked for energy markets to react. It only needs to appear threatened. Following the engagement, crude oil benchmarks saw upward pressure as traders and analysts recalibrated the risk premium attached to Gulf shipping. Insurance rates for tankers operating in the Persian Gulf region climbed sharply. Several commercial operators began quietly rerouting vessels around the Gulf of Oman, adding days to delivery schedules and significant additional costs to every journey. Those costs are not absorbed silently inside a shipping company's balance sheet. They travel down supply chains, they reach distribution terminals, and they appear weeks later on the receipts of ordinary people who simply wanted to fill their gas tanks and go about their lives. A drone attack that lasted less than 2 minutes generated an economic tremor that will take considerably longer to fully settle. Militarily, the consequences are more lasting and more significant than any single engagement statistic can capture. The introduction of Russian upgraded Gyron-2 systems permanently altered the threat assessment for every U.S. and Allied vessel operating in this region. Yes, the swarm was defeated, but the defeat of one swarm does not erase the underlying technology transfer. That knowledge lives in engineering documents, in the minds of technicians, in factory processes that cannot be destroyed by a glide bomb strike on a coastal staging area. Defense planners in Washington and Allied capitals know this. The strategic response has already begun. Electronic warfare investment accelerating, patrol architectures shifting, intelligence sharing between Allied naval forces deepening in ways that will reshape how the Gulf is patrolled for years to come. And then there is Russia's problem, because Moscow is now sitting with a very uncomfortable reality to process. Months of careful, methodical logistics work, the transport flights, the technical upgrades, the careful handoff of battlefield-proven drone knowledge, was dismantled in under 10 minutes of American counterstrike operations. The strategic objective was not achieved. American attention was not drained. American naval presence was not disrupted. The kill web absorbed 40 drones and answered with precision. And the Kremlin now has to decide what that outcome means for its broader strategy of proxy influence across the Middle East. Is Russia going to recalibrate, or is it going to interpret this as a data point and look for the gaps the engagement revealed? That question is not rhetorical. U.S. intelligence agencies are watching Russian transport aircraft movements right now in real time looking for the answer. Iran, for its part, has gone silent. No acknowledgement of the attack, no statement from the Revolutionary Guard, no official Iranian government response of any kind. And that silence is, in many ways, louder than anything that could have been said. Nations that launch operations they consider legitimate do not typically go quiet afterward. The silence tells you something important about how the IRGC commanders who ordered this are processing what happened on that coastline when the counterstrike came. The Strait of Hormuz remains open today. American carrier strike group operations in the region continue without interruption. But the forces that produced those 40 drones have not disappeared. The engineers are still working. The transport routes across the Caspian Sea are still being watched by satellites around the clock. And the fundamental tensions that turned a quiet waterway into a combat zone in the early morning hours are still there, exactly where they were before the first radar contact appeared on an American screen. What those 114 seconds really revealed is something that will shape military strategy, energy policy, and great power competition for the next decade. The era of mass-produced drone swarms as a decisive asymmetric tool has a ceiling, and the kill web just demonstrated where that ceiling is, but ceilings get tested again. Different angles, different timing, different configurations. The question that defense planners are genuinely wrestling with right now is not whether the system worked. It clearly worked. The question is whether the adversaries who watched it work are drawing the right lessons, or whether they are drawing different ones. Russia saw a network defeat a swarm. Some in Moscow will conclude that the swarm needs to be larger. Some will conclude it needs to be smarter. Some will look at the electronic warfare component and ask what happens when the drone carries its own counterjamming system sophisticated enough to hold its signal through interference that defeated this generation of guidance hardware. These are not hypothetical concerns for some distant future conflict. These are the conversations happening in engineering facilities and military planning rooms right now in multiple countries simultaneously in the wake of 114 seconds that the whole world was not supposed to see. The sea is open, the watch continues, and what comes next is already being built somewhere by someone who took very careful notes on everything that just happened.